The cabin lights flickered once, then died. Somewhere behind row 14, a woman gasped, and the hum of the Boeing 787's engine seemed to catch, stutter, and smooth out again, but not before every screen in economy went black. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," the flight attendant said, her voice tight enough that no one believed the comm and IT. In seat 22C, Elena Whitcomb set down the paperback she hadn't been reading. She'd felt it before the lights died. A faint shudder through the airframe, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. Her hands, folded in her lap a moment ago, were suddenly still in a different way. Train still dot up in the cockpit. Captain Dale Osei stared at a primary flight display that had just rebooted itself into a diagnostic loop, red text scrolling past faster than he could read it. "Tara, I'm losing attitude data," he said. "Confirm on your side." First Officer Tara Lindqvist's voice cracked. "Confirmed. I don't have airspeed either." Neither of them saw it yet. But 300 miles away, a scramble order was already going out to 2 F-15 Eagles sitting alert on a runway, because Meridian Flight 812 had just gone dark to air traffic control. No transponder, no radio, no confirmation anyone was still alive up front. If you've ever wondered what quiet competence looks like in the middle of chaos, stay with this one to the end. Because in 11 minutes, 2 fighter pilots were going to look through their canopy glass and recognize someone they never expected to see again. Subscribe now, because you will not believe who Elena Whitcomb used to be. Major Elena Whitcomb had flown F-15C Eagles for 14 years before she ever set foot on a commercial jet as a passenger. Call sign Ghost, or not for stealth, but because wingmen used to joke that she showed up exactly when things went wrong and vanished the second they were fixed. She'd flown combat air patrols over contested airspace, trained younger pilots in beyond visual range tactics at Nellis, and quietly built a reputation as the calmest voice on any frequency during an emergency. 3 years ago, a mid-air collision during a training exercise had killed her wingman and ended her flying career with a shattered collarbone that never fully forgave her. She'd retired quietly, retrained as a trauma nurse, and told almost no one at County General about the 12 years of her life spent at 40,000 feet with a missile under each wing. It was easier that way. Nobody looks twice at a nurse in seat 22C. She was flying to Seattle for her sister's wedding, nothing more. She'd told herself that in the terminal, in the boarding line, in the seat. She was a civilian now. But when the lights died and the cabin fell into that particular silence, not panic yet, just held breath, every instinct she'd spent a career building came back online at once. She counted the seconds. 22 since the shudder. The plane hadn't lost altitude. That meant the autopilot, or someone very good, was still flying it. Beside her, a college student gripped his armrest and looked to her, the calm woman in scrubs, for some kind of reassurance. "It's probably nothing," Elena said. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 14 years. Major Elena Whitcomb had flown F-15C Eagles for 14 years before she ever set foot on a commercial jet as a passenger. Call sign Ghost, or not for stealth, but because wingmen used to joke that she showed up exactly when things went wrong and vanished the second they were fixed. She'd flown combat air patrols over contested airspace, trained younger pilots in beyond visual range tactics at Nellis, and quietly built a reputation as the calmest voice on any frequency during an emergency. 3 years ago, a mid-air collision during a training exercise had killed her wingman and ended her flying career with a shattered collarbone that never fully forgave her. She'd retired quietly, retrained as a trauma nurse, and told almost no one at County General about the 12 years of her life spent at 40,000 feet with a missile under each wing. It was easier that way. Nobody looks twice at a nurse in seat 22C. She was flying to Seattle for her sister's wedding, nothing more. She'd told herself that in the terminal, in the boarding line, in the seat. She was a civilian now. But when the lights died and the cabin fell into that particular silence, not panic yet, just held breath, every instinct she'd spent a career building came back online at once. She counted the seconds. 22 since the shudder. The plane hadn't lost altitude. That meant the autopilot, or someone very good, was still flying it. Beside her, a college student gripped his armrest and looked to her, the calm woman in scrubs, for some kind of reassurance. "It's probably nothing," Elena said. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 14 years. Major Elena Wickham had flown F-15 Sea Eagles for 14 years before she ever set foot on a commercial jet as a passenger. Call sign Ghost, or not for stealth, but because wingmen used to joke that she showed up exactly when things went wrong and vanished the second they were fixed. She'd flown combat air patrols over contested airspace, trained younger pilots in beyond visual range tactics at Nellis, and quietly built a reputation as the calmest voice on any frequency during an emergency. 3 years ago, a mid-air collision during a training exercise had killed her wingman and ended her flying career with a shattered collarbone that never fully forgave her. She'd retired quietly, retrained as a trauma nurse, and told almost no one at County General about the 12 years of her life spent at 40,000 feet with a missile under each wing. It was easier that way. Nobody looks twice at a nurse in seat 22C. She was flying to Seattle for her sister's wedding, nothing more. She'd told herself that in the terminal, in the boarding line, in the seat. She was a civilian now. But when the lights died and the cabin fell into that particular silence, not panic yet, just held breath, every instinct she'd spent a career building came back online at once. She counted the seconds. 22 since the shutter. The plane hadn't lost altitude. That meant the autopilot, or someone very good, was still flying it. Beside her, a college student gripped his armrest and looked to her, the calm woman in scrubs, for some kind of reassurance. "It's probably nothing," Elena said. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 14 years. Major Elena Wickham had flown F-15 Sea Eagles for 14 years before she ever set foot on a commercial jet as a passenger. Call sign Ghost, or not for stealth, but because wingmen used to joke that she showed up exactly when things went wrong and vanished the second they were fixed. She'd flown combat air patrols over contested airspace, trained younger pilots in beyond visual range tactics at Nellis, and quietly built a reputation as the calmest voice on any frequency during an emergency. 3 years ago, a mid-air collision during a training exercise had killed her wingman and ended her flying career with a shattered collarbone that never fully forgave her. She'd retired quietly, retrained as a trauma nurse, and told almost no one at County General about the 12 years of her life spent at 40,000 feet with a missile under each wing. It was easier that way. Nobody looks twice at a nurse in seat 22C. She was flying to Seattle for her sister's wedding, nothing more. She'd told herself that in the terminal, in the boarding line, in the seat. She was a civilian now. But when the lights died and the cabin fell into that particular silence, not panic yet, just held breath, every instinct she'd spent a career building came back online at once. She counted the seconds. 22 since the shutter. The plane hadn't lost altitude. That meant the autopilot, or someone very good, was still flying it. Beside her, a college student gripped his armrest and looked to her, the calm woman in scrubs, for some kind of reassurance. "It's probably nothing," Elena said. Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 14 years. The two Eagles slid into position off the 787's wingtips, close enough that passengers pressed against their windows could see the pilots' helmets turn toward the airliner. In 22C, Elena hadn't moved back to her seat yet. She stood near the galley curtain, watching through a scratched oval window as a gray fuselage with a familiar squadron marking eased into formation. Something in her chest tightened that had nothing to do with fear. She knew that paint scheme. She'd flown with that squadron. "Ma'am, you really do need to sit down," Raina said gently, guiding her back up the aisle. Elena went because there was nothing yet to be done that wasn't already being done, and because drawing attention to herself now would only complicate things that didn't need complicating. But she watched the F-15 the whole way to her seat. In the cockpit, Osei finally had a working radio and a very welcome escort, but not yet a solution. "Talon, be advised, we've knocked down an avionics fire, but we've lost primary NAV and most of our instrument suite. We're flying partial panel, and we're not confident in our position." Copy that 812, Voss answered. We'll fly point for you. Follow my wing. We'll get you a vector to Cascade Regional. It's got the longest runway and range, and full crash response standing by. Copy, appreciated, Osei said, and meant it more than his voice let on. Behind him, Lindqvist finally exhaled. We're going to be okay, she said, half question, half prayer. Osei didn't answer right away. He was watching the eagle off his wing rock gently, a signal he half remembered from ancient emergency training. Follow me. The relief lasted 4 minutes. Then the cabin lurched, not violently, but enough that drink carts rattled and a dozen passengers cried out. In the cockpit, a new alert bloomed across what remained of the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure. System B, low. That's not related to the fire, Osei said, more to himself than to Lindqvist, though the dread in his voice reached her anyway. That's a separate system. Could the fire have spread into the hydraulic bay? Lindqvist asked, flipping pages in the checklist with hands that had started to shake again. I don't know, Osei admitted, and it was the first time all flight he'd said those words out loud. The 787 was still flying, still responding to control inputs, but sluggishly now like wading through water that used to be air. Off the wing, Voss saw the aircraft's altitude begin a slow, uncommanded drift downward and keyed his mic immediately. 812, Talon, you're descending. Confirm intentional. Negative, Talon, where Osei fought the yoke for a half-second, we're getting some kind of control degradation. Stand by. In the cabin, the seatbelt sign chimed on with a jolt, and Reina's voice came over the intercom, steadier than she felt. Flight attendants, take your seats immediately. Elena's eyes went to the window again. The eagle off the wing had dropped back slightly, giving the airliner room, its pilot's head turning to track every degree of drift. She recognized that instinct too, the reflex to give a wounded aircraft space to breathe. Whatever was happening now, she thought, this crew needed more than an escort. They needed someone who'd flown through exactly this kind of failure before. The 787 stabilized 200 feet lower than where it had started, and for a moment, everyone exhaled again. It didn't last. System B pressure's still falling, Lindqvist reported, voice tight. We're down to 1200 psi. Switch to standby hydraulics, Osei said, running through memory items he'd only ever rehearsed in a simulator with an instructor standing behind him. Not for real, not with 241 people behind him breathing the same recycled air. The standby system engaged, buying back some authority in the controls, but not all of it. The aircraft now handled like something wounded, capable, but no longer fully whole. Talon, be advised, Osei radioed, we've got partial hydraulic loss, standby systems engaged, but our control authority is degraded. We may need a longer runway and more room to work within Cascade Regional can give us. Voss's voice came back immediately, no hesitation. Copy 812. Let me get you options. He switched frequencies to Fairwind's command post. Fairwind command, Talon flight. We've got a heavy in serious trouble, partial hydraulics, partial instruments, request immediate diversion options, and full emergency response. At Fairwind, in a windowless command center lined with radar screens, Colonel Grant Ferris looked up sharply at the report. Give me everything on that airframe's condition, he said, already reaching for a phone. And get rescue trucks moving to every field within 100 miles. Back on Flight 812, Elena Whitcomb sat with her hands folded, watching the wing outside her window dip and correct, a rhythm she recognized instantly as a pilot fighting a system that no longer fully trusted him. And for the first time since boarding, she considered doing something about it. The seatbelt sign stayed on, and Reina moved down the aisle checking each row, her calm now a costume she wore for everyone else's sake. When she reached 22C, Elena caught her sleeve gently. How's the flight deck holding up? Elena asked. Really? Reina hesitated, weighing protocol against instinct, then leaned in slightly. Not great, she admitted, quiet enough that no one else could hear. They've got some kind of hydraulic problem on top of the fire. I don't think they're panicking, but I don't think they're confident either. Elena nodded slowly. Reina, that's your name, right? A nod. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust that I'm not just being dramatic. Go tell the captain there's a passenger in 22C who flew F-15s for 14 years, including combat systems failures like whatever he's dealing with right now. Tell him her name is Wickham. Tell him it's his call, not mine, but I'm available. Raina's eyes widened. You flew fighter jets? A long time ago, Elena said. Go, please. Raina went, weaving up the aisle faster than procedure technically allowed, and knocked twice on the flight deck door before identifying herself over the intercom per protocol. Osei, mid-checklist, barely had bandwidth to process what she was telling him. A passenger says she's a former fighter pilot, he repeated, half disbelieving. 14 years, F-15s. She said combat systems failures like this one, Raina said. Captain, I don't know if it means anything, but she wasn't asking to help. She was telling me she's available. Outside the windows, Talon's eagle rocked its wings once, the old signal for attention, and Voss's voice crackled through, steadier and more urgent now. 812, be advised your descent rate's picking back up. You need to make a decision soon. Osei had 11 seconds to decide, and he used every one of them doing math. He didn't have time for a degraded airliner, 241 souls, a runway that might not be long enough, and now an unverified stranger 300 feet behind him claiming a background that sounded almost too convenient to be true. But convenient wasn't the same as false, and right now, he had nothing to lose by asking one question. Bring her up, he said. 2 minutes. That's all I can spare. Raina sprinted back down the aisle. Elena was already standing, having unbuckled the moment she sent Raina forward, some instinct telling her this would go exactly the way it was going. She walked the aisle at a controlled pace, not rushed, not hesitant, the same pace she used to walk toward her jet before a mission, when panic helped no one and calm was contagious. Passengers watched her pass, sensing without understanding that something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. At the flight deck door, Raina knocked the code, and Elena stepped through into a space thick with the smell of burnt insulation and the low hum of alarms neither pilot had time to silence. Captain, she said, Elena Whitcomb. Retired Major, United States Air Force, 14 years flying F-15 Eagles, combat systems instructor at Nellis. I'm not here to take your airplane. I'm here because I've seen electrical bus failures cascade into hydraulic loss before, and I know some things that might help you buy time. Osei stared at her for exactly 1 second, the length of time it took to decide he had no better options. Talk fast, Major. Outside, off the wing, Voss watched the airliner's attitude steady slightly and frowned, wondering what had just changed in that cockpit. Your standby hydraulics are carrying the load the primary system should be sharing, Elena said, crouching beside the center console, eyes scanning the panel with a speed that told Osei more than her resume had. That's why you're fighting the yoke on every correction. You're one system down from full authority, but you don't have to fly it like you're one system down for disaster. Trim for it. Use the stabilizer, not muscle. Let the airplane help you instead of wrestling it. Osei adjusted the trim as she spoke, and the yoke's resistance eased, just slightly, just enough to feel like breathing room. That's better, Lindqvist said, startled. Your descent rate's not a system failure, Elena continued. It's overcorrection. You're chasing the airplane instead of leading it. Small inputs. Trust the trim. Osei made a smaller correction this time, and the aircraft settled into a stable, if imperfect, glide path. For the first time in 11 minutes, something in the cockpit felt like control instead of survival. Talon 812. Osei radioed, voice noticeably steadier. We've got improved control authority. Stand by. We may be able to make Cascade Regional after all. Voss's reply came back immediately, curious now. Copy that improvement, 812. What changed? Osei glanced at Elena. We got some expert help up here, Talon. There was a pause on the radio, the kind of pause that meant someone was thinking hard about a strange coincidence. Then Voss's voice again, careful. Copy. 812, if that expert's former Air Force. Tell her Talon says thanks for the assist. And tell her Echo's asking if Ghost still owes her $20 from Nellis. Elena went very still. Osei blinked at the radio, then at Elena. You know him? Elena didn't answer immediately. $20 from Nellis was a joke exactly one living person would remember. A wager from a training exercise 7 years ago, back when Priya Shah had been a green lieutenant and Elena had been the instructor who'd humbled her in a mock dogfight, then bought her a beer to soften the blow. "Put me on the radio," Elena said quietly. Osei handed her the headset without hesitation now. "Talon, this is—" She paused, then let the old habit take over, because pretending otherwise would waste time neither of them had. "This is Ghost. Tell Echo she still owes me $20 in a rematch." The frequency went quiet for 2 full seconds. Then Voss's voice, no longer careful, edged with something between disbelief and relief. "Ghost? Major Wickham? I thought you were flying a desk somewhere." "I'm flying a middle seat somewhere," Elena said. "Talon, listen to me. This crew's good, but they need altitude and airspeed data cross-checked, because half their panel is dark. Can you fly close formation and call it out for them?" "Copy that. Already planning," Voss said. "Ghost, good to hear your voice. Wish it was under better circumstances." Off the right wing, Lieutenant Priya Shah, Echo, allowed herself a small, disbelieving laugh inside her oxygen mask. Of all the airplanes in the sky today, her old instructor had been sitting in coach on this exact one. In the cabin, passengers had no idea any of this was happening. They only knew the ride had, somehow, gotten smoother. Word moves fast even without an announcement. 2 rows behind Elena's now empty seat, a retired schoolteacher named Alma Reyes had watched the flight attendant hurry a passenger to the cockpit, and now watched the aircraft's flight path steady out the window, and drew her own conclusions. "Did you see that woman go up front?" she whispered to her husband. "I think she just saved us." Up front, Colonel Ferris at Fairwind Command finally had the full picture relayed to him. Fire, partial hydraulics, a retired Air Force major assisting the flight crew, and 2 Eagles flying close escort. He exhaled once, the particular exhale of a man who'd spent 30 years hoping never to need this exact combination of facts. "Get Cascade Regional's crash crews doubled," he ordered, "and patch me through to that cockpit. I want to hear this myself." Voss adjusted his formation, sliding the Eagle in tighter, close enough now that Osei could see the pilot's oxygen mask move as he spoke. 812, Talon, I'm going to call your altitude and airspeed off my own instruments until you're stabilized. Trust the numbers I give you." "Copy," Talon appreciated, Osei said, and for the first time, he sounded like a captain who believed he'd get his airplane on the ground in one piece. In the cabin, Elena's absence had become its own kind of story. Passengers leaning across aisles, murmuring theories, none of them close to the truth, all of them somehow calmer for believing something was being handled by someone who knew what they were doing. They weren't wrong. They just didn't know how right they were. Back in the cockpit, Elena watched Lindqvist's hands on the yoke and recognized the particular fatigue of a first officer running on adrenaline with nothing left in reserve. "You're doing exactly what you should be doing," Elena said to her, quiet enough that it wasn't for the recorder, only for the person who needed to hear it. "Small corrections. You're not behind this airplane. You're right where you need to be." Lindqvist's shoulders dropped half an inch, the first sign of tension leaving her body all flight. "Thank you," she whispered. Osei kept his eyes forward, working the radio with Voss to refine their heading toward Cascade Regional, a runway carved into a river valley between 2 ridgelines Elena remembered from a training map a decade old. "Talon, what's Cascade's runway length?" 8,200 feet, 812, Voss answered. "Should be enough with your current configuration, but you'll want every foot of it given your hydraulic state." Elena did the math in her head automatically. Approach speed, degraded braking authority, crosswind component from the valley's known wind patterns. "Captain, request you brief for a longer flare and expect reduced braking. If the standby system's carrying full load, your anti-skid may not perform at full capacity." Osei nodded, already adjusting his mental approach plan. "Tara, brief the cabin for a hard landing configuration. Full brace positions. I don't want anyone caught off guard." Lindqvist reached for the intercom, voice steadier now than it had been in 20 minutes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for landing. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened low and tight, and follow the brace position as demonstrated." In the cabin, Reyna moved down the aisle a final time, checking each row, her calm no longer a costume. It had become real somewhere in the last 10 minutes, borrowed from the woman who'd walked past her toward the cockpit like she'd done it 100 times before. At Fair Wind Command, Colonel Ferris listened to the radio traffic scroll past on a speaker, arms crossed, watching a radar blip descend steadily toward Cascade Regional's coordinates. Beside him, a young airman monitoring the same feed frowned at his screen. "Sir, that passenger who's assisting," the name that came over the radio. "Wickham. That's not a common name in the squadron's files, but I ran it against retired personnel anyway." "Colonel, she's got 2 distinguished flying crosses." Ferris looked over sharply. "Confirm that." "Confirmed, sir." Major Elena Whitcomb, retired 3 years ago after a training accident. Instructor pilot, weapons school graduate, over 3,000 hours in the F-15C. "She's not just a former pilot, sir. She's one of the best we ever had." Ferris exhaled slowly, something between relief and awe settling into his chest. "Give me eyes on Cascade Regional's runway condition and crash response status. And patch a line through to Talon flight. I want a status update every 60 seconds until that aircraft is on the ground." On Flight 812's flight deck, none of them knew yet what Fairwind had just confirmed, but Osei didn't need a personnel file to trust the calm, precise voice beside him. Trust had already been earned, one correct instruction at a time. "Talon 812, we have Cascade Regional in sight. Request final vectors," Osei radioed. "Copy, 812. Come left 10 degrees, descend and maintain 3,000. You're clear to set up your approach." "Echo, and I will stay with you until wheels down." In the cabin, passengers braced, some praying, some gripping strangers' hands, all of them unaware that above and beside their crippled aircraft, for the finest pilots the Air Force had trained were quietly, fiercely determined not to let a single one of them fall short of the runway. The valley opened beneath them like a seam in the mountains. Cascade Regional's single runway, a pale gray ribbon between stands of dark pine. From the flight deck, Osei could see it now with his own eyes, not just on a screen, real close, achievable. "Gear down," he called, and Lindqvist responded with the checklist, voice clipped and professional now, fear folded neatly beneath procedure. The gear extended with a groan that sounded, to everyone in the cabin, entirely too loud, though it was only the sound every landing gear made, amplified by fear into something ominous. "Talon 812, gears down and locked, flaps configured on final," Osei reported. "Copy, 812. Looking good from up here," Voss said. "Echo and I will break off at 500 feet and orbit until you're clear of the runway. You've got this." Elena watched the altimeter, one of the few instruments still fully functional, and did the mental math of 100 landings, most of them on far less forgiving runways than this one. "Captain, at 200 feet, expect the standby hydraulics to feel heavier in the flare. Don't fight it. Let the nose come up slow." Osei nodded once, jaw tight with concentration. Below, at Cascade Regional, fire trucks lined the runway's edge, lights flashing silently in the afternoon sun, crews standing ready beside foam cannons they hoped they wouldn't need. In the cabin, Alma Reyes gripped her husband's hand and closed her eyes, murmuring something too quiet to be anything but a prayer. At 100 feet, the runway rushed up to meet them, close now, real now, the moment neither pilot would ever fully describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. 50 feet, Lindqvist called. 30. 10. The main gear touched down hard, harder than either pilot wanted, softer than either had feared, and for one suspended second, the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath alongside its passengers. Then the nose gear settled, and Osei called for reverse thrust and brakes with a voice that had found its center again. "Braking," he said. "Braking S-soft, Teta, max reverse." The runway blurred past the windows, trees at the edges standing like witnesses, the aircraft slowing by degrees that felt agonizingly gradual to everyone aboard and remarkably controlled to the 2 people flying it. They rolled to a stop with nearly 1,000 feet of runway to spare. For 3 full seconds, Nobody in the cockpit spoke. Then Lindqvist made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed both hands over her face. 812 is down, Talon, Ose radioed, voice cracking for the first time all flight. We're down and stopped. Voss's reply came back immediately, warmth breaking through military discipline. Copy that, 812. Damn good landing. Ghost, if you're still listening, Echo and I are buying you that beer after all. In the cabin, cheers and sobs mixed together in a single wave of sound, passengers gripping each other, some laughing, some crying, all of them alive. Reyna leaned into the flight deck doorway, tears in her eyes. Major Whitcomb, she said, I don't know how to thank you. Elena, still crouched by the console where she'd spent the last 20 minutes, finally allowed herself to exhale fully. Thank the crew, she said. They flew it. I just reminded them what they already knew. Ose looked at her, something unspoken passing between two people who now shared something few ever would. Outside, the two F-15s peeled away into a slow victory roll over the valley. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within 90 seconds, foam trucks flanking the wings on either side, though no fire had followed them to the ground. Stairs were wheeled to the forward door, and passengers began the slow, shaking process of disembarking onto a runway none of them had expected to see again. Alma Reyes paused at the top of the stairs, looking back toward the cockpit door, hoping for one glimpse of the woman who'd walked past her seat an hour ago. She didn't get it. Elena had stayed behind at Ose's request, helping brief the arriving investigation team on exactly what had happened and why the standby systems had performed the way they had. On the tarmac, Colonel Ferris himself had driven out from Fairwind, arriving just as the last passengers cleared the stairs. He found Ose first, shook his hand, thanked him for a landing that would be studied in training manuals for years. Then he turned toward the cockpit door as Elena stepped down onto the runway, still in the same scrubs she'd boarded in that morning. Ferris straightened instinctively, an old reflex from 30 years of saluting officers he respected. Major Whitcomb, he said, it's an honor. I read your file on the drive over. 2 distinguished flying crosses. Weapons school instructor. And here you are, flying commercial in a nurse's uniform. Retired is retired, Colonel, Elena said, though something in her posture had shifted, straighter now, the old bearing returning like muscle memory. Not today it wasn't, Ferris said. Today you were exactly what that flight deck needed. Nearby, Ose overheard the exchange and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle over him. Not just what he'd survived, but who had helped him survive it. Voss and Shaw landed 20 minutes later, diverting to Cascade Regional's small municipal strip once their fuel state demanded it, taxiing their Eagles to a stop near the terminal where a small crowd of relieved passengers had gathered. Shaw was first out of her cockpit, helmet under her arm, searching the crowd until she found the woman in scrubs standing near the terminal doors. Ghost, she said, breaking into a run that wasn't remotely regulation. I can't believe it's actually you. Elena caught her in a hug that surprised them both. Look at you, Echo. Full lieutenant now. Flying lead position like you always said you would. I learned from a best, Shaw said, stepping back, eyes bright. You disappeared after the accident. Nobody knew where you went. I went to nursing school, Elena said simply. Turns out I still wanted to save lives. Just a different way of doing it. Voss approached, extending a hand, more formal but no less warm. Major, on behalf of Talon Flight, it was an honor flying escort for you today, even if we didn't know it was you until about halfway through. You did good work up there, Elena said. Both of you. That crew's alive because of good flying on every side of that formation, not just mine. Nearby, Ose and Lindqvist stood together, watching the reunion with something like awe. She really was one of the best, Ose said quietly. She still is, Lindqvist said. She just doesn't fly for a living anymore. Reyna, standing a few feet away with a cup of coffee someone had handed her, found herself smiling despite the exhaustion settling into her bones. Some stories, she thought, you don't get to hear the whole of. This was one she'd been lucky enough to witness firsthand. By evening, Cascade Regional's small terminal had become a temporary command post. investigator from the airline, a regional NTSB liaison, fair wind personnel, and 241 passengers waiting for arrangements to their final destinations. Elena found herself repeating the same account to 3 different officials, each time more tired than the last, each time deflecting credit toward the crew with the same quiet insistence. I gave them information, she told the NTSB liaison. Captain Osei and First Officer Lindqvist flew the airplane. Don't let the story become about me instead of them. The liaison, a woman named Constance Argento who'd investigated a dozen incidents in her career, studied Elena for a long moment. Major, in my experience, the story becomes about whoever the truth points to. And right now, that's you as much as them. Elena didn't argue further. She was too tired, and some battles weren't worth winning. Outside, Colonel Ferris coordinated with airline representatives on getting the passengers rebooked, while Voss and Shaw remained on standby, their Eagles refueled and ready should any further support be needed, though the crisis had, for all practical purposes, ended the moment the wheels stopped rolling. Osei found Elena near the terminal's vending machines, both of them nursing coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. I owe you my career, he said. Maybe my life. Maybe 240 other lives. You'd have found a way, Elena said. I've seen good pilots fight through worse with less help than I gave you. Maybe, Osei said, but I didn't have to find out because you were sitting in 22C. He paused. Can I ask you something? Why didn't you say anything when you boarded? You could have told the gate agent, told someone. Elena considered the question longer than it seemed to deserve. Because most days, nobody needs to know, she said. Today just wasn't most days. That night, in a hotel room near Cascade Regional arranged by the airline, Elena finally called her sister, 3 hours later than planned, and with an explanation that sounded, even to her, almost too strange to be true. You did what? Her sister said, somewhere between shock and laughter. You told me you were tired from flying. You said you were done with all that. I'm done with it, Elena said. This was different. This was just being where I was needed. You're still coming to the wedding, right? Tomorrow. Wouldn't miss it, Elena said, and meant it, though every muscle in her body felt like it had run a marathon it hadn't trained for. Down the hall, in a different room, Osei sat with Lindqvist and Reyna, the 3 of them replaying the day in fragments, the particular exhausted camaraderie of people who'd survived something together and would carry it for the rest of their lives. I keep thinking about the moment she walked onto the flight deck, Lindqvist said, like she'd done it 1,000 times. She probably had, Reyna said, just never in scrubs before. Osei was quiet for a moment. You know what got me the most? She never once made it about her. Even standing there with 2 distinguished flying crosses in her file, she kept turning the conversation back to us. Like she genuinely believed we'd have figured it out ourselves. Maybe we would have, Lindqvist said. Eventually. But I'm glad we didn't have to. At Fairwind, Colonel Ferris filed his incident report late into the evening, and somewhere near the end of it, added a line he didn't have to include but felt compelled to anyway. Civilian assistance from a retired Air Force officer was instrumental in preventing what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. Her conduct reflected the highest standards of the service she once represented. The wedding, the following afternoon, felt like stepping into a different life entirely. One with no failing hydraulics, no fire, no radio calls, just her sister in white lace and their father crying quietly in the front row. Elena sat near the back during the ceremony, still faintly sore, still processing a day that had upended a carefully maintained anonymity she'd built over 3 years. A local news crew had already run a short segment on the emergency landing. Mystery passenger helps crew land crippled jet, though they hadn't yet identified her by name. A small mercy she suspected Colonel Ferris had quietly arranged. During the reception, her sister found her near the edge of the dance floor. So, she said, handing Elena a glass of champagne, are you going to tell me the whole story, or do I have to read about it in the paper? The whole story, Elena said, is that I did what anyone in my position would have done. Elena. Her sister's voice softened. Not everyone in your position would have known what to do at all. That's the part you keep skipping. Elena didn't have an answer for that, not one she was ready to say out loud. Instead, She watched her sister return to the dance floor, laughing, radiant, entirely unaware of how close the day before had come to being one Elena would have missed by minutes and mountains. Her phone buzzed. A text from Priya Shah. Talon, and I want to take you to dinner before you fly home. Our treat. Non negociable. Elena smiled, the first easy smile of the last 2 days, and typed back a single word, deal. Somewhere over the mountains behind her, 2 F-15s sat cooling on a tarmac, their pilots already telling a story that would spread through the squadron by morning. The one about the retired major who'd been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Dinner with Voss and Shah turned into 3 hours of stories neither pilot had heard before. Elena's early years at Nellis, the training accident that ended her flying career, the quiet decision to become a nurse instead of disappearing entirely from a life of service. You could have gone anywhere, Shah said. Corporate flying, airline captain, instructor somewhere. Why nursing? Because I wanted to keep helping people, Elena said, just without 400 pounds of ordnance involved. Voss laughed, then turned more serious. For what it's worth, Major, Fairwinds put in a request. They want to fly you out for a ceremony. Recognition for your actions yesterday. Ferris is pushing hard for it. Elena shook her head slowly. I don't need a ceremony. I don't think this one's really about what you need, Shah said gently. I think it's about what that crew and everyone on that airplane deserves to see, that quiet competence like yours still exists and still matters. Elena considered that for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly on the table. All right, she said finally, but no big speeches. And Osei and Lindqvist get equal recognition. They flew that airplane. I just talk. Deal, Voss said, echoing the words she'd texted Shah the day before. And for the first time all evening, Elena let herself laugh, easy and unguarded, the way she used to laugh with her old squadron before everything changed. Outside the restaurant, the mountain air had turned cool with evening, and somewhere above the ridgeline, the first stars were emerging over a valley that, 24 hours earlier, had nearly become the site of a very different kind of story. Elena looked up at the sky the way she always did now, not with longing exactly, but with quiet respect for a place she'd loved and left and loved still. The ceremony, held 2 weeks later at Fairwind Air Force Base, was smaller than Elena had feared and warmer than she'd expected. Osei and Lindqvist stood beside her on the small stage, both in their airline uniforms, both insisting, correctly, that none of them had done this alone. Colonel Ferris spoke briefly, formally, about the difference between training and instinct, and how rarely the two combined as completely as they had in the skies above Cascade Regional. Voss and Shah stood near the back in their flight suits, grinning through most of it. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she kept it short. I spent 14 years believing the most important thing I could do was fly, she said. It took a burning airplane to remind me that showing up, really showing up, wherever you happen to be, matters more than the uniform you're wearing when you do it. Afterward, Raina Cole approached her quietly, having flown in specially for the ceremony. I never got to properly thank you, she said. You didn't just help the pilots. You made me believe I could stay calm too. I don't think I would have without watching you. You were already calm, Elena said. You just didn't know it yet. Alma Reyes, the retired schoolteacher from row 20, had written a letter that Ferris read aloud during the reception. A simple, heartfelt account of watching a stranger walk toward a cockpit with total certainty and feeling, for the first time in a frightening hour, that everything might actually be all right. By the end of the day, Elena had shaken more hands than she had in years, accepted a small commemorative medallion she planned to keep in a drawer rather than display, and quietly slipped away before the reception's formal photographs, back toward a life she'd built for herself, one shift at a time. 6 weeks later, Elena Whitcomb clocked in for a night shift at County General. Same scrubs, same quiet competence, same total anonymity restored. A young resident glanced at her badge and asked, half joking, if she was the nurse from that plane thing. And Elena just smiled and said she'd heard something about that too. She still thought about it, though. Not often, but in the particular quiet of a hospital hallway at 3 a.m., she'd sometimes remember the exact sound of the cabin lights dying, the the exact weight of the moment she decided to stand up from seat 22C instead of staying seated and safe. She'd received one letter, forwarded through fair wind, from Dale Osei. It said, simply, that he still thought about that landing every time he flew, and that he hoped, wherever she was, she knew the difference she'd made hadn't faded with the headlines. It hadn't. She just carried it quietly, the way she carried most things. If there's one thing this story should leave you with, it's this. The people who matter most in a crisis are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who've already done the hard work, long before anyone needed them to, and who show up without needing credit for it. Somewhere out there, someone sitting quietly in seat 22C, or standing behind a hospital desk, or working a job nobody thinks twice about, is carrying exactly that kind of readiness. You'll probably never know it until the moment you do. If this story moved you even a little, consider staying a while longer. There are more like it here, waiting to be found.